Chapter 19, Forest. 50 points, Potter? Malfoy stared at him incredulously. Harry shrugged. For attacking a teacher, anybody else would have been expelled, should have been expelled, Malfoy said. Harry had already heard an earful from Hermione, and he stared impassively at the other boy. The only reason that Harry cared about house points was that losing them angered the other Slytherins. He was already seeing unfriendly looks from the upper years, and if he survived the night, it was going to mean trouble. It's just proof that you're dangerous. If you're doing this first year, what are you going to do? Burn down the entire castle before you graduate? Malfoy's outrage had overtaken his usual fear of Harry, and he was saying things that Harry suspected he usually said behind Harry's back. Harry looked at him impassively and said, "Quirrell irritated me." Quirrell had been needling him all semester. Malfoy had been there. He'd seen what had happened. He'd been there during the attack. "Everybody irritates you," Malfoy said, "except that mudblood and that blood traitor." At Harry's look, Malfoy held up a hand. "I don't know what your problem is with the man, and I certainly don't know what his problem is with you. You need to solve it before the upper years come and beat you to death in your bed." "I didn't know you cared," Harry said. "They don't know who sleeps in which bed," Malfoy said dryly, "and I doubt some of them would care." "What with your father's connections?" Harry asked. "Some people," Malfoy said with a significant look in Harry's direction, "do stupid things and regret it later." "Like dueling with Weasley in the corridor," Harry said. The look Malfoy gave him was blistering. Having detention at 11 o'clock at night was almost as insane as sending children alone into a monster-inhabited forest, accompanied only by a groundskeeper who looked like every groundskeeper in every horror movie ever. They met with Filch, who glared at them with an evil grin. "Attacking a teacher, fighting in the halls, wouldn't have happened in my day. My day they had real punishments. Hanging from the ceiling by the wrists for a few days would do the lot of you some good." Harry wondered where Filch had gone to school. As a squib, he couldn't have gone to Hogwarts. Filch chuckled darkly. "This might be better, though." Apparently, Malfoy and Weasley hadn't been told where they would be serving their detention. They both looked uneasy as Filch lit a lantern and led them outside. The moon was bright, but dark clouds kept plunging them into impenetrable darkness. Harry had to watch his step. Falling and breaking his neck before he even reached the forest would be a nastily ironic death. With his luck, he'd suffer through all the pain and then wake up 2 minutes before he fell. Having to repeat the same horrible evening over and over was his conception of hell. After a few minutes, they managed to reach the caretaker, who was carrying his own lantern. The light from the lantern lit his face in a way that made it look even more sinister than it usually did. It made him look almost ghostly. "What are we doing?" Harry heard Malfoy ask uneasily. "You'll be going into the forest tonight, boys," Filch said, a sort of unnatural glee in his voice. He grinned. "Whether you'll be coming out is another story." "There's acromantula in the forest," Weasley said. His face was pale in the lantern light. "Giant spiders the size of the night bus." Harry hoped that was an exaggeration. Something that size wouldn't be able to move through the trees. "And werewolves," Malfoy said. He glanced up at the moon. "If my father knew how you were endangering me, he'd—" Filch was already walking away. The groundskeeper held the lantern up and said, "You think he doesn't know where you are, boy." "What?" Malfoy asked. "He hasn't been very loyal the past few years. He needs to be taught a lesson." Malfoy looked almost as alarmed as Harry felt. The man was as much as admitting to be a Death Eater, and if that was the case... Harry carefully reached into his pocket for his wand. He'd brought his cloak stuffed into his pack just in case. If he could just get away, he'd be able to vanish without any of them seeing him. Weasley seemed not to catch the implications of what the groundskeeper had just said. "Get moving. We don't have all night." "What are we doing?" Weasley asked quietly. The groundskeeper bent down and showed them a silvery trail on the ground. It glowed in the moonlight and was oddly beautiful. "That's unicorn blood." The man looked up at them. "We're tracking it." Malfoy stared at the man for a moment, then asked, "Why, isn't it your job to keep the animals in their places?" "You're my helpers tonight, boys," the man said. His grin was nasty. "Why's it bleeding?" Weasley asked, staring at the ground. The trail led into the forest. It surprised Harry that the unicorns got this close to the castle, and he wondered who else knew about it. "There's something in the forest killing the unicorns," the groundskeeper said. "We're hunting it down." Both Weasley and Malfoy looked pale and ghostly now. Harry suspected that they'd both be more careful about dueling, assuming they survived the night. The trail wandered and split shortly after they walked into the forest. The groundskeeper said, "Looks like we'll have to split up and cover more ground." Draco glanced back and forth between Harry and the groundskeeper. On the one side, he seemed concerned about the groundskeeper's cryptic remarks, worried for once that the man might actually try to hurt him to get back at his father. On the other side, while he knew Harry could take care of himself, it wasn't like being protected by a fully adult wizard. In the end, that seemed to be what caused him to make his decision, because he insisted loudly on going with the groundskeeper. They followed the groundskeeper into the darkness of the forest. The only light was the moonlight through the trees and the light of the caretaker's lantern. Eventually, they came to a fork in the path. Malfoy and the caretaker took the path to the left, and Harry and Weasley took the path to the right. Despite what the caretaker had said, Harry wondered if Malfoy's inclusion had just been to give plausible deniability in the case that Harry didn't come back. After all, if a prominent pureblood had been assigned the same punishment as Harry, it couldn't be all bad, could it? As the light from the lantern retreated into the distance, Harry turned and saw Weasley lighting his wand. Apparently, his spell-casting issues from earlier in the year were resolved, because the light shone shockingly in the darkness. "Cut that out!" Harry snapped, closing his eyes in an attempt to maintain his night vision. "Why?" Weasley asked, but at least he extinguished the light. "Anything in the forest will be able to see the light from further away than we'll be able to see them," Harry said. "Like the spiders and werewolves?" Harry nodded. Opening his eyes, he noted that the forest seemed even darker than it had before. He cursed to himself. "Besides, you may need your wand for something else," Harry said, "if things get bad. Why do you think he was carrying a lantern? It was to keep his wand free." Idly, Harry wondered if there were spells to allow someone to see in the dark. He was sure that some people had learned to transfigure cats' eyes for themselves, but he wouldn't want to try that until he was very good. The light from the lantern faded off into the trees. This left Harry alone with Weasley in the forbidden forest. "We'd best get to it," Harry said, after giving his eyes a chance to adjust. Weasley stared at him for a moment before saying, "Sorry, mate." "For what?" Harry asked distractedly. The darkness made him uneasy. It would be easy for an enemy to snipe at them from the darkness, and they'd never know what had hit them. Only the fact that having a light would make that even easier instead of harder kept Harry from wanting a light. "For what happened to your friend?" he said. At Harry's sudden sharp look, he held up his hand. "I heard you talking about it to Hermione and Neville." Harry scowled. He'd thought he was more careful about being overheard than that. He hoped this didn't endanger Pusey's family. Still, Weasley was at least attempting to extend an olive branch. He hadn't done as much bullying in this time as he had the last time, and he couldn't really be held responsible for what his previous self had done. "It's all right," Harry said, although he could see from Weasley's expression that they both knew it wasn't. "Thanks for saying so." "You think they're really going to make us go into the forest?" Weasley asked fearfully. "With the spiders?" Harry nodded grimly. "The sooner we get it done, the sooner we get back," he said. Part of him considered simply pretending to traipse off into the woods while hiding instead. If he'd been with Malfoy, he'd have considered it, but with a Gryffindor coming along with him, it wasn't going to happen. Even if Weasley was afraid of spiders, Harry doubted that he could keep a secret. Malfoy would have been happy to skiv off and show up later. If he'd been thinking, he would have gone with Harry. And then neither one of them would have had to go. Instead, he was with a Gryffindor who would undoubtedly think cheating was a terrible thing. One of his brothers would have been much more likely to go along with the idea. They followed the silvery trail into the forest, which grew darker and thicker the farther they walked. "Why aren't you afraid?" Weasley asked suddenly from behind him. Keeping conversation to a minimum was one of the things that might keep them alive, but Harry suspected that Weasley was one of those who needed to hear himself talk to deal with his own fear. "Who says I'm not afraid?" Harry asked, glancing behind him. Considering that fear was his constant companion, Harry wondered if he might have simply gotten used to it. Was this bothering him less than Weasley because this was his entire life? "You sure don't show it," Weasley said. "Half the people in my house would like to kill me," Harry said, "and the other half are afraid of the first half and won't support me." "Yeah? You learn not to show weakness pretty fast or you don't survive." Weasley was silent after that, for which Harry was pleased. The boy was making enough noise moving through the forest. Harry was doing a little better, due to his practice at being stealthy. Even he was making more noise than he'd like, however. They wandered around, following the meandering trail for what seemed like forever, before Harry heard Weasley hiss behind him. Weasley had spotted something. Blood splashed against a tree, as though the unicorn had staggered and flailed against it. The trail continued out into a clearing. Harry moved more cautiously now. The blood seemed fresher here, and he suspected that they were about to find whatever it was that they were supposed to find. It occurred to him that the caretaker hadn't given them any way to alert him when they found the unicorn or its killer. He'd been preoccupied and hadn't questioned it. His stomach clenched. Whatever they were about to face, it was likely very close. Bright and gleaming on the ground, the unicorn was dead. Harry felt a catch in his heart at the sight of it. It wasn't often that he really appreciated magic, and sometimes he envied the wonder he saw in the Muggle-born's eyes. Suddenly, he wished he could see a unicorn in all its glory. Unicorns represented the pureness and innocence that had been stolen from Harry. Living with the Dursleys, Harry wasn't sure he'd ever had it. It was a bitter envy to see Hermione or the others living life unconcerned about possible dangers at every corner. Harry stiffened as he heard a slithering sound. He froze, holding up a hand for Weasley to do the same. Out of the shadows emerged a dark figure, crawling along the ground like some kind of beast. It moved slowly toward the unicorn. The familiar smell of rot was in the air, along with lingering traces of garlic. If Harry hadn't known what he was looking for, he likely wouldn't have noticed it. Harry stood motionless in the shadows, and to his credit, Weasley didn't move either. They both stood and watched as the figure lowered its mouth to the neck of the unicorn. Before Harry realized what he was doing, his wand was out and he was shouting, "Diffindo!" The figure jerked out of the way, and Harry dodged as a bolt of green light struck the place where he'd just been standing. "Run!" he shouted to Weasley, even as he dodged behind a tree. He struggled to remember the lessons Flitwick and his books had taught him. Make use of cover and concealment. Avoid being silhouetted against a skyline or against light-colored objects. Carefully select a new fighting position before leaving an old one. Harry grabbed his cloak and quickly pulled it over his head. It was important to avoid setting a pattern, and the time he left himself exposed had to be limited. Firing off another spell at the figure, who dodged behind a tree, Harry moved. It was hard not to make noise moving through the leaves and underbrush, and he cursed to himself. He'd need more practice, if he ever got the chance. "Diffindo! Diffindo! Diffindo!" Harry yelled. Although Quirrell dodged, Harry thought he saw a darkening pool of blood on his left sleeve. Harry felt his wand being yanked from his hand, and he cursed to himself. He hadn't bothered with a shielding charm, knowing it wouldn't stand up to whatever Quirrell planned to use against him. He moved quickly through the darkness, his cloak covering him, even as flashes of light flew through the area he had been in. Harry saw his wand lying on the ground 6 yards away. Quirrell was a dozen yards away, looking off in the direction of the last place Harry had been. It was a clearing, and so there wasn't a lot of leaves or undergrowth. Harry carefully sued every skill he'd practiced to move slowly toward the wand. "There's no one coming, boy," the voice suddenly shrieked. A sudden flare lit the entire area in a blinding light as bright as daylight. Harry froze, his night vision suddenly gone. The only compensation was that Quirrell seemed as confused as he was. "I wouldn't be so sure of that," Dumbledore said, stepping out of the forest. Quirrell suddenly whipped around, pointing his wand at Dumbledore. "I was just looking for the boy. It's not safe out in the forest." "You were the one who set him this task," Dumbledore said mildly. "I was concerned, and so I followed discreetly. Imagine my surprise to see what you have been up to with the unicorns." Harry cautiously began to bend down. Under the bright lights, he hoped that his invisibility cloak covered all of him. "I'm ill," Quirrell said bluntly. "This is just to keep me going long enough." "You won't have the stone," Dumbledore said quietly. "Perhaps there is something St. Mungo's can do." "You think I haven't tried that?" Quirrell snarled. He wasn't even pretending to stutter. "I even went to Muggle healers. This is the only solution." Harry's hand grasped the wand. "No," Quirrell said, and a moment later he apparated away. "Harry," Dumbledore said sharply, "come here." Harry hesitated, not sure it was entirely safe. He began to walk toward the headmaster, who looked in his direction and seemed to know exactly where he was. He felt a sudden surge of displaced air behind him, and a moment later he felt his cloak being pulled away from him. The tip of a wand was placed against his forehead. "Step away or the boy dies," Quirrell snarled, staring up at Dumbledore. Harry reached up and grabbed Quirrell's wrist, feeling a sudden surge of pain even as Quirrell screamed. He tried to wrench the wand away from his forehead, and he twisted his body even as Quirrell yanked his hand away. Quirrell's wrist was blistered. "I wouldn't have thought it of you, Quirinus, playing host to something like that," Dumbledore said. "Harry is protected by things neither you or your master can ever understand." "Kill him!" the voice from the back of Quirrell's head shrieked. The two wizards suddenly exploded into action, and Harry ducked out of the way. He bent down and grabbed his cloak, and he started running through the forest. At this point, all staying would do was distract Dumbledore and risk his getting hurt. Harry doubted the combat would last very long. Quirrell was sick and weakened, and Dumbledore was at the peak of his strength. The most likely outcome would be that Quirrell would apparate away, which meant Harry needed to get back inside the wards of Hogwarts as soon as possible. As he reached the edge of the forest, Harry saw Malfoy, Weasley, and the groundskeeper. He felt a sudden surge of exultation. He'd done it! Dumbledore would remove Quirrell, and Harry would be as safe at the school as he had ever been. He felt a sudden surge of relief. It was over, at least for now. "I found the others," Weasley said excitedly. "I was trying to get help when we saw the light." The shift in the groundskeeper's expression was Harry's only warning before the older man went for his wand. Harry twisted out of the way, even as he lifted his own wand to point at the other man. He wasn't fast enough, and he felt his torso explode beneath him. As he fell into darkness, his last thought was that for all his good points, Dumbledore was pants at hiring people.